I'm going to go ahead and I turn on the recording, and I know how Watershed partners are that we're always a little slow to get ourselves logged on in the morning, but I'll start doing the reverse of the long Minnesota goodbye. I'll do the long Minnesota hello. So welcome to the monthly Watershed Partners meeting. And I'm Angie Hong. I coordinate the East Metro Water Resource Education Program that's out in Washington County. It's a local government partnership with 25 members. And I'm one of the members on the Watershed Partners Steering Committee. And I'm just going to keep kind of doing a slow talk as people are logging on. Abby, are you like officially kind of co-moderating, or are you just giving an update about next month? I apologize for not quite remembering.
That's okay. I can give a quick update for next month. My job today was just to moderate or to monitor the chat and like help anybody with technical difficulties.
Excellent.
So, but I can give a little spiel for next month. So next month, there's a group of us who have been working together on a project called Developing Culturally Relevant Outreach Materials. We've kind of turned into like a community of practice where we're really trying to learn how to reach broad and diverse audiences with our messaging as effectively and sort of collaboratively as possible. So we'll be facilitating a roundtable session in the October meeting. That's on October 14th. We're actually going to start at 9 o'clock, like back in the olden days, next month. And we'll be hearing from 3 speakers. One is Megan Dayton, who is a state demographer. She's going to talk a little bit about the demographics of the state and how that is forecasted to change and shift in the coming years. We will also be hearing from Mark Dene at Capital Region Watershed District about their process of developing a diversity and equity strategic plan. And we'll be hearing from Tammy Schmitz, formerly of the MWMO, who's going to be talking about some learning and success working with different and focused cultural groups on outreach, water outreach stuff. So that'll be a full 2-hour session where we'll be hearing from each of those speakers, and then there'll be some facilitated breakout groups, and it should be a really good, useful session. And we put it together, we started putting it together early in the spring, but then after all of the events of the summer and civil unrest and the discussion that we had as Watershed Partners in July, really tried to be responsive to what we were hearing everybody talking about in the way that we put this together. So should be great. Plan on being there.
Yeah, thank you. So our speaker today, Sarah Hobbie, will be joining us in a little bit, and she'll be talking about stormwater nutrient pollution of Twin Cities waters, talking about some of the research that's been happening with University of Minnesota and MPCA. So we have a bit of time before she joins us so that we can do more of the partner updates and sharing that we haven't had time to do in some of our previous meetings. A lot of times, you know, we're kind of cramming things in because we've got presenters and limited amount of time for a webinar. As it's going to be that way next month for sure when we're having this roundtable conversation. So I am thinking that the most streamlined way to do this might be if you use the let's see, I'm trying to think of how you do that, like hand raise. Not there's like one hand that's like the hollow wave kind of hand, and then there's one that's like I'm raising my hand. If you wanted to, you know, take a moment to kind of share with the group some of the changes that you've been making, something exciting that you've got coming up, or just a question that you'd like to ask the group, maybe do the little hand raisey thing, and we can use that to try to try to do people in order. And I will start with Britta then, because I see her little hand went up.
Yeah, and I just did it by opening the participants channel and then hit raise hand.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So lower that. But yeah, we are restarting. We worked with the Isaac Walton League of America last year to get a citizen chloride monitoring program going just based off of theirs. And we are working on doing that again this year. And we just put out a notice in the Coon Rapids newsletter, and we've had some really interested folks already contact us. And we also created 100 kits for our local community college to work on doing that. So
so where are they doing monitoring? I'm interested to know more about that.
Yeah, so it's wherever they want, that's easiest and safest for them. So we're really, our water quality coordinator, Justine Dauphiné, wanted us to especially try and catch periods of melt either from curbsides or from local water bodies. So we said one or the other, just to try and figure out where our chloride hotspots are in the district.
Okay, that's very exciting. So I'm just going to take this moment also to mention that you can use the chat function if you have an update that you would like to share or a link to something. You can put that in the chat feature, and then I'll be able to send all that out as notes along with the video recording after the meeting as well. So I'd be super interested, Gail, to know like how to put together those kits, because that's something I'd love to try to do with people out here too.
Yeah, for sure.
I see Mark has his hand up.
This seemed like a good time as any to talk about this. The city of Shoreview is just completing a really, really important roadway corridor project through our community that's in the vicinity of two high quality water bodies. It's North Owasso Boulevard is the name of the roadway project. And the reason why I'm bringing it up to you is that the model that we use to develop the stormwater management philosophies for this project was a really, really interesting collaboration between the city, Ramsey County, and Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District. I would also point out, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this, that next week we'll begin the installation of what's going to be probably the largest permeable pavement on a high volume collector street in the state of Minnesota. It's going to be a product called Paved Drain. I'm not repping that product or anything. It's what we've settled in on as our permeable pavement tool that we use. And so it's a very high profile project. It's a $6.5 million project that we're completing this fall. And it's been just really a special project because of the collaborative nature between these agencies and the really, really creative stormwater management principles that we've used. The project is going to be high profile. It's going to be submitted for national awards and state awards in a lot of areas. So sorry for the long description, but if anyone is interested in seeing this permeable pavement being constructed, it's going to be done next week. And I'd be happy offline or after this meeting to get you pointed in the right direction or give you any details if you're interested in that topic. So thank you.
Yeah, so which road is this that it's happening on next week?
The road is called North Owasso Boulevard.
North Owasso, okay.
North Owasso Boulevard, and it goes through a county park that is on, that's Lake Wabasso is on the north side of the roadway and Lake Owasso is on the south side of the roadway.
That's very cool. That's very cool. It's very exciting.
It's the biggest, it's probably one of the most ambitious roadway projects that the city of Shoreview has ever undertaken, at least in my 26 years here. So a lot of special design elements that were, and I would just say the impetus for the project was stormwater management and lake water quality. And so it's got kind of that story attached to it. So Mark, thank you for your patience.
Mark, can you remind us how long a distance it is? You know, the road reconstruction?
Sure, Sage. The roadway is about 1.5 miles long. And
it's permeable the entire length of it or just portions of it?
No, there's, okay. I wish. No,
yeah, that would be a lot.
There's a number of stormwater management BMP philosophies and approaches that are being used in the project, but there's one area, it's actually right where the county park is. So if you're familiar with the roadway corridor, if you can picture Lake Wabasso Park and Lake Owasso road access, the permeable pavement is in that area.
Wow. Okay, that's very cool. I saw Dawn Doring had her hand up.
Yeah, and actually I want to piggyback and say hi, Mark. We asked Mark to come speak to our CAC next month on chlorides. And Mark, are you looking at chloride monitoring at all with that road project and, you know, the chloride impacts?
Wow, I'd love to. I mean, if I was more research minded and not so much of an engineer, I probably would have thought of things like that ahead of time. There is no monitoring. I mean, there isn't any sort of monitoring infrastructure that's being used. I think anyone who's heard me speak on permeable pavements knows that if we're using permeable pavements as any element of a public infrastructure project, it means we have a different winter maintenance protocol for those areas, and we don't use salt on those areas. So that's my sideways answer is we're not going to salt the permeable pavement, but as you know, salt washes in from a lot of other areas as well.
Great. Well, I look forward to talking with you more about your talk next month with us. But for everyone else, we're going to be actually, it might be a couple months now, we're going to be having a new look to our website and some new navigation, and we're slowly rolling out our new logo and branding. And so we're really excited about that. And so we're hoping to work with particularly our regulatory audience, our permittees and applicants in making that simpler, that process. So if anyone has any tips, tricks, or lessons learned they want to send to me, feel free. And it's great to see you all.
I know it is. I know it's only been, maybe we meet in August? We haven't met since July. That's what it feels like. It's been so long since I've seen everyone. In terms of an update from our office, we are working on planning a virtual soil health field day on October 8th, which I think will be kind of a fun experiment in using, video, Zoom, and real life. We would, our office, the Washington Conservation District, typically works a lot with farmers, and we would often do something like a field day in October. And our farmer that we are working with, Pam Arnold, she farms about 40 acres of land up in Scandia by the St. Croix River. And her farm manager said, absolutely not. I do not want a whole bunch of people walking around on our property right now. And so we are going to try going out and taking some video clips ahead of time and then having her on live and setting it up kind of as a hybrid between a panel presentation and a virtual field day where people can still feel like they're walking on her farm. But I share that just because I know that some of you also work with these kind of hybrid, both rural and urban communities. And if it's something you're interested in, since we do stuff virtually nowadays, you actually could participate in our soil health field day. So I'll send out info as soon as we have registration going. I see Gina here has a hand up.
Hi, I'm Jenna.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator at Great River Greening in St. Paul. Just an update from us is that we will be having a fall volunteer event season this year. We canceled all of our spring events, but we are coming back this fall. We're going to do 4 public events on Saturdays throughout September and October. We're doing much smaller capacity and shifts and sort of switching around the design of our events to prevent gathering and eating and excessive talking and all of that stuff, but still getting folks out to do invasive removal and planting. We're going to be doing 2 plantings and 2 invasive brush hauls. So yeah, if anyone is interested in learning more about the events that we're having or opportunities to get outside with us this fall, let me know. I can put some information in the chat. Thanks.
So I'm curious, Jenna, did you have problems working with like county parks and state parks and getting permission to have volunteer events on the property? Because we've had some problems with that in volunteer events that we wanted to hold.
It kind of depends on the landowner and where the project is. So some harder than others. Generally what has been the request of the landowner is that we're limiting the capacity pretty strictly.
Okay.
And so we usually recruit for a pretty high attrition rate, and we're not doing that as much to ensure that we don't accidentally have too many people on site to exceed landowners' requirements for how many people. And some project partners are like letting us do the restoration work and letting us have folks, but are asking to not be named as like a partner or like as a promotional partner to help in that way. So we're using the land, but they're not necessarily like promoting it internally or externally in the same way.
Yeah, because we've had that problem that we thought we could safely plan volunteer activities. Like you said, that we were either spaced out over the day and people signed up in shifts, or they were very small groups and spread out. And then we had both county parks and state parks telling us that they didn't want us to do the events even the way we were trying to plan them. So I just wondered how you got around that.
Yeah, and I'd say, I guess I'm kind of running in my head through where we're going to be. None of them are county or state parks.
Okay.
More of them are citywide, or like,
Okay,
and then the one that is more of a countywide thing is the one that is kind of distancing from us in that way. So, yeah.
All right. Speaking of the state, I see Janine Cohn has her hand up. Janine, you there? There you
Try
are.
not to. Can you hear me? I'm trying to unmute.
Yep.
I'm looking at the people on here, and I don't know if I see any people that are on the Metro Water Festival board. And if there are, I just thought I would share with everyone that our Metro Children's Water Festival has gone virtual. And there's a press release that was sent out yesterday, and there's a series of virtual trainings and YouTube Live and career segments and diverse backgrounds in careers in natural resources. So who should I send this to, or where would you like me to put this so that everyone has access? Because some of these live presentations, people, teachers, students, parents need to sign up for. But if they don't get into that particular segment that they want to watch, it will be recorded so that you could watch it later. And it goes for a whole week this year. So if there's anyone on the board that's on this call, feel free to add in. But
yeah, well, and Janine, you should be able to use the oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking on what is the name of our new listserv.
Mobilize?
The
Is it on Mobilize?
Mobilize, yeah. You should be able
okay.
to use Mobilize because it has the ability to function both as an email, but also as a place to post content.
Okay.
But if you send out an email through Mobilize, that will go to like the whole Watershed Partners listserv, and you should, I think, if you go into the actual Mobilize website, be able to put stuff there that will stay permanently.
Okay. All right. I will try and do that later this afternoon, but there's
Janine,
someone's gonna talk.
Janine, what is the date? What's the dates of this event?
All right. It is the last week of September into the first week of October. And it has all of that information in the press release.
So the stuff is just going to be happening all week long throughout the week, like on every day there'll be a different.
Yeah, there'll be different things. So, you know, unlike the one-day event, we have different speakers per day and different seminars. For example, there's a gentleman that's talking about fish biology and identification, and then he sent lesson plans. What's nice, if you go, if you're interested in this, go to the Children's Metro Water Festival website, and it is outlined down to the agenda, the speakers, and all of the different things going on. And this group has spent the better part of the last, I don't know, 4 months putting this together. And it is exciting. And there's a whole resource section that if you're a teacher or a parent, you just want to get some lesson plans or a link to some cool video, we have that in one section. And then we have live presentations or recorded live presentations. And again, this year, we're adding a career segment. So if teachers would like to share with their students opportunities for people to learn about careers in natural resources, it's on there. And we actually ask specific people of diverse backgrounds to share how they got into that career. So I couldn't be more proud of the group that I've worked with, and it's an amazing resource that'll go way beyond the metro. So tap into it and share it with others. Yeah. I will make sure that I'll send it definitely, Angie. If I didn't send it to you, I'll send it to you. Okay. I know some people on this are speakers for that. I know Linden, if I saw Linden's on there, and I think they have a presentation on there with the National Park Service, and you know, John Shepard, if you're listening, I see you're on here. I would really like to make sure either between you and Linden that we get your resource link connected to this water festival. So
that's great. Thank you for sharing that, Janine.
Yeah,
I'm pretty excited about seeing it.
All right.
So speaking of Linden's hand is up. I'll call on him next.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Angie. Just to tag onto that, thanks, Janine, for mentioning all that. And yes, we are listed among those resources, and we'll be providing an activity from the National Park Service as part of the Children's Water Festival. Also, just wanted to remind folks that since school is in session now and teachers are looking for resources, that we have our distance learning site is up and running, and thanks to collaboration with Hamline University Center for Global Environmental Education, Mississippi Park Connection, and other partners, we have distance learning resources posted, and I will put this in the chat as well, but they're at parkconnection.org/learn. And from there, you can get into Big River Journey online, Living River online, virtual classroom visits. We have a number of topics available. Primary focus is upper elementary grades, but we have some opportunities for other grades too. So I'll put that in the chat, but encourage folks to share that far and wide. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there other people in the group today that would like to share updates on what you've got going on? So let me ask you this. Back in the spring, a lot of us ended up converting our workshops to webinars. And I know for our organization, we kind of had a whole set of stuff that we had planned spring and summer. And then I got to the fall and I was like, wow, now what do we do? Because I it kind of did a good job of thinking of what we were going to do for the next 6 months. And my mind had not really processed as far forward as what to do with a continued state of virtual existence into the fall and the winter. So what kinds of things are you thinking of doing this fall? Just kind of curious. Anybody got? I see Jen. Jen had her hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, sorry. Forgot I didn't have my little microphone down there. Two things. They're not the most exciting, but because school just started, the Vermilion River Watershed is doing the ABCs. So every day we're posting, like yesterday was A is for adventure, and then we've got a recreational map trying to get people out. And today was B is for butterfly, and our partners in the city of Lakeville have a pollinator garden. So it's going to be a lot, 36 or 26 days worth of finding a new place within the watershed, but kind of tying it to the beginning of school. We're also working, I don't know, it's fun. I'm still working on the end of the alphabet. we're also working with the city of Hastings, and we're doing follow the Vermilion River through Hastings, because a lot of people in Hastings don't know that the Vermilion River travels through there, or don't know where to go for fishing access. So we're working on a little story map, and then it's Watershed Wednesday, and it started last week, for people just, you know, in Hastings or whoever wants to find a new place to explore along the river. We got some historic facts, and but we haven't planned any in-person events. So we're just trying to do all these things digitally, get people out. But so
yeah. How about others? Any others doing stuff, either small scale in person or fun, creative, virtual things that you're doing this fall?
Hi, this is Anne with the City of Lakeville. I can't figure out how to raise my hand.
That's okay.
Sorry.
It works.
I just wanted to share, this summer we had an environmental education intern at the City of Lakeville here. And she created all sorts of puppet shows that are on YouTube that are environmentally based, that are kind of fun to check out on the City of Lakeville YouTube page. And then it's not up yet, but we're in the process of getting up. She created a whole bunch of lesson plans based on 5 different subject areas that kind of are geared toward younger kids, as well as like middle school and high school. Really well thought out lesson plans that'll be available hopefully within the coming month. Trying to get that up as soon as I can since school has started. Some of it is for distance learning, but some of it's just adapted for either. It's not all distance learning, but options for teachers and other educators in the area.
That is very cool. I am partly stalling for time because Sarah Hobbie had a class that she was teaching right before she's going to come and present to us. And so she is not on the call yet. And so I will continue doing the long Minnesota transitional conversation now that follows the long Minnesota hello. Thinking of things that we're doing together as Watershed partners, there's of course the Adopt a Drain program, which we've been working very hard to promote this year. And if you've checked in on it lately, I think that it's up to somewhere around like 12,000 drains that have been adopted in the Twin Cities metro area. But we are coming up on leaf fall season, leaf falling season. So I imagine that a lot of you might be thinking of educational messaging that you're normally getting out at this time of year to tell people to rake leaves and get them out of the street and out of the storm drains. Any cool things anybody has planned related to Adopt a Drain promotions?
I have something, Angie.
Yes, Lane.
This is specific to Minneapolis, but I had a great master water steward who lives in Northeast Minneapolis, and she started something called the Northeast Adopt a Drain Challenge. So it's she's been doing a lot of work, and I wish I could hire her. She's so great. But she took all 10 neighborhoods, and she and I met with a number of them, and she's keeping track of the numbers before, during, and afterwards. They're coming up with a storm drain Saturday. They got a grant from the great folks at MWMO. Abby's probably aware of that, for some storm drain kits that people can rent with gloves and brooms and rakes and things like that. And it's been going swimmingly. And I just got the last update yesterday, and they've already collected in the last 2 months like over 1,100 pounds of stuff in just Northeast Minneapolis. So I'll once that's done, I'll probably share that with the group. So
that's very cool. And I saw you just put in the chat that it's actually 13,000.
Yes.
That have been adopted. So I underspoke in terms of how awesome this group has been. So that's really very exciting to see how that program has been progressing. I know in our community this Saturday, I'm leading a very small group of volunteers to do storm drain stenciling and put out door hangers to promote Adopt a Drain. And they'll be doing the same thing up in Forest Lake as part of what is usually a really large community event. And then pretty much all of the other components of the event had to be canceled because of, like I said, us not being able to get permission to do cleanup on state and federal property. So we kind of shrank it down to be storm drain stenciling and adopt a drain promo. Stalling still. Hey, Sarah, I'm hoping she joins us soon.
Angie?
Yeah.
Angie, I could mention a couple of things that we're working on.
Yes, please
We
do.
have a large scale restoration going on up in Shoreview. It's part 2, second year of a restoration in a big wetland complex where there's been a lot of flooding and fluctuation of water. So we've, last year, of course, we had students out there, 300 and some students. This year, we had planned to have 17 classrooms who are being now covered by various master water stewards who have helped us through the summer at different time periods. And we recently had a group out there of about 13 people helping us. It's such a large area, we can really easily social distance in a planting. But we've been working on developing modification of some plant guide research signs that we actually, information that we modified for signs, and we've got those out as a temporary self-guided tour. And that got the notice of a lot of people, including some of the photographers who really frequent that area. So hope to have some publicity about that. And we're also doing a similar kind of thing because of the new boardwalk that is being built in Woodbury in the Tamarack Nature Preserve area. So there'll be a weekend, probably at the end of September, when that will be advertised once the boardwalk is done. And we'll have similar kind of wayfinding signs that are temporary with QR codes and other signs that will be up for a while until the city has time to work on more permanent signage. So both of those will be promoted. We've done a little bit of promotion on the Shoreview one and expect some press release coming soon on that, as well as a lot more signs going up temporarily.
Very cool. That made me think of a virtual tour project that we're getting ready to do that I had forgot to mention, but I saw that Lyndon has his hand up, so I'll call him Lyndon instead.
Sure, since you're stalling for time, I just wanted to add that next Tuesday, a lot of neighborhoods are going to be celebrating National Night Out. And so we're going to be drawing attention to Adopt a Drain at our National Night Out and using chalk art to celebrate our storm drains with kids. So there's an opportunity.
I don't seem to be able to raise my hand, maybe because I'm a co-host, but I just wanted to add, the MWMO put out a virtual tour, bike tour, excuse me, of our, several of our projects that are all relatively close to the river. And it's about an 8-mile bike loop that has, we have a Google map that has embedded video links so you can see me talking about each of the different sites and follow along on the map and get directions. And there's nice ride stations. And anyway, we hope that it's fun and accessible. And if any of you use it or promote it, we would love to hear feedback.
Yeah, Abby, that made me think, so Sage's update that led to yours made me think of the very similar project we're doing with the Browns Creek Watershed, because the Browns Creek State Trail runs pretty much right through the middle of the Browns Creek Watershed, and they've got a number of projects along it. So we put together also this kind of virtual tour, and we have a map, and we were all excited, and then we said, MWMO already did it. It's not even original. We just, it was like parallel evolution. We thought of the same idea at the same time. But we're trying to think of, you know, how to make it interactive. At the moment, we're thinking of some kind of, I might either hide real life prizes for people to find at a couple of the stations along the way, you know, just kind of the way you would with geocaching, because I've got several little prizes left over from my summer events. But we were also talking about having people take pictures, you know, and if you visit at least like 5 of the 7 stops along the way and take a picture and, you know, post it someplace, then you get entered for a bigger prize, a bigger, more awesome prize than one of my teeny tiny compasses. Sarah, welcome. It looks like Sarah has joined us now. And Sarah, we've been kind of stalling for time and doing our partner updates and intros. And I think we have shared just about everything that all of us can think of to tell one another that we've got going on this fall. And probably a lot of our minds are also being pulled in multiple directions with the back to school mayhem happening. So I'm going to go ahead, if you're ready, and introduce you. I'm going to first of all make you a co-host so that you should be able to share your screen, okay? Yep. And Sarah is a distinguished McKnight University professor in ecology, evolution, and behavior at the University of Minnesota, with research focusing on three main areas: the influence of changes in atmospheric composition and climate on ecosystem processes, the effects of urbanization and suburbanization on biogeochemical cycles, and the influence of plant species on biogeochemical processes. So today she is going to be talking to us specifically about stormwater nutrient pollution in Twin Cities in the waters, the sources and solutions. And if you feel like you're ready to go, Sarah, I can go ahead and turn things over to you, and then just let me know if you need more from me. We've got about 40 people on today, and it's a mix of people from local government, watershed educators, city staff people, and other folks working in the stormwater world.
Great. I think I should be ready to go. Thanks for waiting for me. Today was my first class, of course, on Zoom, and then I had a bunch of people stay after class to ask questions. So I just finished teaching, and so thank you for being patient. So yeah, and thanks for the invitation to speak to you today about the work that we've been doing on stormwater nutrient pollution in the Twin Cities. I want to start by giving a particular shout out to Jacques Finlay, who's a faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and Ben Janke, who is a researcher at the U of M. They, along with a bunch of other people that I'll acknowledge at the end, have been really active in working on these projects with me. So, all right, so I know that I don't have to say to this group that we, as urban residents, get a number of benefits from our surface waters, including recreational benefits, even, fishing benefits, climate regulation benefits, aesthetic benefits. And this has become particularly clear as we've been in this pandemic and people have congregated outside to enjoy all of these benefits. And we have made huge progress in cleaning up our surface waters. This is a picture from the Historical Society. I don't know how many of you have seen this photo, but I just love it. It's this is Sweet Hollow, and you can Phelan Creek running through it, and you can see these outhouses that are perched right over the creek. And so obviously we've made a lot of progress in managing our surface waters in the Twin Cities since this photo was taken. And we can see data to support that. This shows the phosphorus concentrations or the phosphorus loads at the Metro Wastewater Treatment Plant in the Twin Cities over several decades. And you can see that we've been able to manage our wastewater and treat our wastewater so that we've driven phosphorus levels way down. So we're really good at dealing with point sources of water pollution in the Twin Cities, but we're not so good at, we haven't made as much progress in addressing non-point source pollution. And so this is Como Lake, which is my neighborhood lake. and you can see evidence of extreme eutrophication. They've actually, I think there's some folks from Cap Region on the Zoom today, and they've put some new management efforts into play this summer. So it'll be, fingers crossed that those make a difference. But we're seeing in many of our metro surface waters evidence of eutrophication or excessive algal growth, mainly from high inputs of phosphorus and nitrogen. And our urban nutrient pollution also has downstream consequences outside of cities. So for instance, this shows the phytoplankton bloom that occurs in the Gulf, in the Mississippi Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Mississippi. And these pink areas are urban sites. And we know that most of the nutrient pollution that's contributing to the phytoplankton bloom or the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico are coming from agriculture, but there is an urban contribution as well. So this shows one estimate of the sources of phosphorus to the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that there are, about 16% is coming from urban areas, but an additional 13% is coming from wastewater treatment plants, which are primarily in urban areas. So urban areas are contributing about 30% of the phosphorus to the Gulf. So my point being that nutrient pollution in urban systems is important, both because it impacts urban surface waters, which give a lot of benefits to urban residents, but there can also be downstream consequences of urban nutrient pollution in coastal areas as well. So it's important that we try to understand these sources of pollution and what some solutions are. So, why are urban systems so prone to eutrophication? And one reason is the unique hydrology that urban systems have. And so I think we're all aware of the high degree of imperviousness in urban systems because of the roads and the parking lots and the buildings. We've drastically altered the hydrology. And in order to prevent flooding, because we have all this imperviousness, we've constructed these artificial drainage networks that are really different in how they transport water and nutrients from natural drainage areas. And so essentially, we've replaced our headwater streams with city streets. And so I like to think of the city streets as our headwater streams. So these are receiving water and materials from the land. And if we didn't have ways of rapidly draining these waters, we would be in big trouble because we would have all sorts of flooding occurring. And so we've constructed then these drainage networks to rapidly move water off of the urban landscape. And when we rapidly move water off the urban landscape, we also move all of the materials that water can carry. And then we move this material into our creeks, which are largely, at least in the Twin Cities, looking like this. So here is Phelan Creek, and it is inside of this drainage pipe. So this is an awesome figure that shows the historic water bodies in St. Paul. And for those of you who live in St. Paul, you're probably realize that, we no longer have these large wetland areas. Most of our streams are now buried, as I just mentioned. So this shows, how we used to have these large wetland areas. We used to have more lakes. The lakes that we had were larger, and there used to be a lot of streams that drained this area. And now, of course, the wetlands have been filled in, many of the lakes have been filled in, and many of the creeks have been buried, although there are recent efforts to unbury those creeks. So for instance, at Trout Brook, and then in the new Ford Plant site. So as an ecologist, I have not always worked in urban systems. But I've brought sort of the perspectives and approaches of ecology to my work in urban systems. And so one of the approaches that I've been using is what I'll call the small watershed approach. So this approach was really championed in small watersheds in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, particularly Hubbard Brook, if you've heard of that. And this is a picture in the White Mountains. It's not Hubbard Brook, but it's just one watershed over from Hubbard Brook. This was actually a hike that I did with my husband and my kids. And the idea behind this small watershed approach is that when you have a watershed that's basically underlain by bedrock, you can measure everything that's coming into that watershed and then in precipitation. And then you can measure what's being exported from that watershed at the out the stream, basically, and any differences in what's coming in versus what's leaving has to be due to processes that are happening in the watershed. And so by comparing inputs to the watershed versus what's being exported, then you can learn something about what kinds of processes are operating in the watershed. And so this is my cartoon of a watershed. And so as an ecologist, if I'm interested in understanding what's going on in this lake at the bottom of the watershed, then I consider, what's not only what's being exported into that lake, but also what's happening farther up in the watershed. So what are the new inputs of, say, nutrient pollutants that are coming into the watershed? How are those being processed as they move through the soil? What are the processes that transport nutrients from the watershed into streams? And then what kinds of processes are responsible for moving and cycling nutrients as they move downstream, including through potential wetlands? And then how do all of those processes influence what ends up in the lake? And so our urban watersheds look really different from this cartoon watershed that we might find outside of an urban area in a couple of different ways. First of all, our artificial drainage networks are really dense. So we have these super dense drainage networks of pipes that reach high up into the watershed. And so what that means is that a lot of those opportunities for cycling and potential retention of nutrients sort of along the flow path have now been removed or eliminated. And so this can affect water quality downstream. But maybe we can get ideas about how to manage water quality downstream by thinking about what's happening higher up in the watershed. And so we've essentially been taking this kind of small watershed approach in the Twin Cities by looking at what's being exported from storm drains and comparing that to the inputs of nutrient pollutants that are coming into the watershed. And then thinking about what are the processes that are responsible for moving nutrients throughout the flow paths, and does that give us any additional insight into how we might solve some of our water quality problems. So today I'm going to focus on three main questions. First of all, what are the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus to urban watersheds? Are those nutrients, when they come into the watershed, are they retained in the watershed or do they end up being exported? And if they're exported, what are the major pathways that contribute to that export? So how are nitrogen and phosphorus lost from these watersheds? So I'll start by talking about the sources of nutrient pollutants, and I'm going to focus on some urban residential subwatersheds of the Mississippi.
Hey, Sarah, you got muted somehow.
Okay, I have no idea how that happened.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I thought it was just my imagination that I couldn't hear you anymore. And then I
No,
realized-
I got a little thing that came up that said I was muted. Anyway, so I think my shout out to Capital Region Watershed District got muted. I want to acknowledge all the work that they do to monitor these subwatersheds. It's just been a gold mine for us to analyze the data that they've collected and to augment the sampling that they've been doing. So I'm going to focus on these colored watersheds, and each of the red dots represents one of Cap Region's monitoring sites. And this is where they collect data on stormwater, both stormwater volume and flow, and also the concentrations of different constituents, including nutrient pollutants, nitrogen and phosphorus. And so all of these are located, these monitoring stations are located in storm drains. And so for these watersheds, basically, we were able to put together a picture of all the nutrient pollutants that are coming into the watershed. And so we did this through a variety of different methods. We sent out surveys to households about their pet ownership and their pet waste pickup practices and their fertilizer use. We used models to get at things like nitrogen deposition, and we also did some field measurements to estimate things like biological nitrogen fixation by clover. So I'm not going to go into much detail about how we did all this work, but feel free to ask me about it later on. And if there are any, I'm not monitoring the chat right now, so just, shout out, and if you have any questions, feel free to shout those out. Okay, so this first slide shows the inputs of nitrogen and phosphorus to these watersheds. And I've arranged the watersheds, so each of these bars represents a watershed, and I've arranged them from the most residential watershed to the least residential for both nitrogen and phosphorus. And here I'm expressing inputs on a kilogram per square kilometer per year basis. So I'm basically normalizing for the watershed area, because these watersheds differ quite a bit in their area. And so if we look first at nitrogen, you can see that the dominant source of new nitrogen to these watersheds is residential fertilizer. So even though a lot of people don't even use fertilizer on their lawns, because lawns make up such a large area in these watersheds, it adds up so that residential fertilizer ends up being the biggest source of nitrogen to the watersheds, followed by atmospheric deposition and then household pet waste. And so this is, household pet waste represents nutrients that come into the watershed as pet food, because people go to the store and buy their pet food, they feed it to their pets, and then their pets either urinate or defecate outside. And we're talking about dogs here, actually, because they're much more important than cats. And then some fraction of the dog poop basically ends up outside. And so this represents the urine, the nitrogen in urine, and also the feces that don't get picked up. And we estimate that based on surveys that have been done. If we look at phosphorus, because we have a ban on, or restriction on residential phosphorus use, we see that actually pet waste is the dominant form of phosphorus that's coming into these watersheds. There's a little bit of phosphorus fertilizer that's used on golf courses and on the University of Minnesota campus, but it's small compared to the pet waste inputs. And then there's also some atmospheric deposition coming in as primarily dust. So I just wanted to say a little bit more about the household phosphorus or nitrogen fertilizer use. It's interesting, some work that we've, hopefully you can see this now. Some work that we've done suggests that it's actually a small fraction of households that contribute the majority of the nitrogen fertilizer to these watersheds. So this comes from some survey work that we did, where we found that, you know, like if all households were contributing equally to nitrogen fertilizer inputs, they would fall along this 1-to-1 line. But if we plot the contribution to the total fertilizer inputs against, you know, the percentage of total households, we find that 20% of the households are contributing about 70% of the total nitrogen coming into these watersheds in fertilizer. And a lot of those companies, or a lot of those houses are using lawn care companies. Similarly, if we look at the pet inputs, you know, 20% of households are contributing about 80% of the pet phosphorus inputs. And those are, you know, households that own, you know, 2 large dogs. Whereas, you know, about half the households don't have pets and aren't contributing any of that phosphorus. So there's this disproportionality thing going on with some of these inputs where they're not distributed evenly across all residential landscapes. Okay, so we've gotten the nitrogen and the phosphorus into these watersheds primarily through fertilizer and atmospheric deposition and pet waste for nitrogen, and primarily through pet waste for phosphorus. So then we asked, you know, is this phosphorus and nitrogen retained? Is it held in the watershed somehow, or is it exported? And so to get at that, we needed to know all the different ways that nitrogen and phosphorus are exported from these watersheds. So these graphs are similar to the graphs I showed you previously, except now I've got exports here as opposed to inputs to the watershed. And you can see that a lot of the export is happening through storm drains. So this is the blue bars, but there's also some export happening when people basically take their yard waste to the collection sites, and then that actually gets taken out of the watershed to a large commercial compost facility. There's some that gets returned as mulch, and we accounted for that when we looked at inputs. So a lot of being exported out to storm drains. And so here now what I've done is looked at this in a slightly different way, where I'm looking at the inputs on the x-axis compared to what's being exported in the storm drain, accounting for this yard waste removal. And so if inputs equal export, like everything that's coming in on an annual basis is basically being exported, then, or the equivalent amount is being exported that year, then these points would fall on the 1-to-1 line. And so the main thing that I want you to notice is that there's a really big difference between nitrogen on the left and phosphorus on the right. So nitrogen, there's a lot less being exported on an annual basis than is coming in net inputs. So we seem to have retention in these watersheds for nitrogen. Whereas phosphorus, almost everything that's coming in on an annual basis is being matched by exports. So these watersheds are super leaky for phosphorus. They're really good at exporting phosphorus. So I'll talk briefly about nitrogen and what might be going on here. And what we think is going on is that probably this nitrogen actually isn't being held in the watershed, but is being exported through loss pathways that we haven't quantified. So if we go back to our little cartoon of our urban watershed, you know, we're measuring everything that's coming into the watershed and comparing that to what's being exported in the storm drain. And it's possible that there are lost pathways like denitrification, so where microorganisms in the soil, either in lawns or in rain gardens or in catch basins, are converting that nitrogen into gaseous form that's then emitted to the atmosphere. And we're, you know, there's probably like hot spots in the urban setting that are really good at supporting these denitrifier organisms, and catch basins is probably one of those because all the conditions are perfect for denitrification in a catch basin. It's also possible that there's movement of nitrogen, especially as nitrate, sort of deeper into the soil, and then it's being exported. It's moving through groundwater and then seeping out into the river. So there's some evidence that this is the case, because if we measure the nitrate concentrations in springs right in the Twin Cities, they're often super high. So we're probably getting loss of nitrogen to the river, but we're just not capturing that in our measurements. So what about phosphorus? Why are these systems so leaky for phosphorus? Well, we think that there are a couple ways that these urban systems are just super effective at exporting phosphorus, and it has to do with all of this impervious cover that we talked about previously, or that I talked about previously. So the last part of my talk, before I talk a little bit about solutions, I just want to talk about the major ways that nitrogen and phosphorus are moved out of these landscapes into our surface waters. And so one way that we've been, one loss pathway or export pathway that we've been focusing on is trees. And so when trees are planted adjacent to streets, they're really effective at moving phosphorus into the street. So trees take up phosphorus from the soil and nitrogen, and they invest that into their leaves. And then in the fall, the tree reabsorbs about half of the nitrogen and phosphorus and stores it for using next year. But the remainder remains in the leaf. And then when the tree drops its leaves, those nutrients end up in the street in litter fall. And so street trees really are effective pumps that move nutrients from the soil into the street. Oh, there was something else that I was going to say. Anyway, I'm sure I'll think of it in a second. So this litter fall is really rich in nutrients, and unless those nutrients end up being picked up either by a resident or by a street sweeper, those nutrients are going to make their way into stormwater. Oh, and so what I was going to say is that basically any nutrients that are in those leaves are available to organisms downstream. Those are highly bioavailable forms of phosphorus and nitrogen. So anything that ends up in the storm drain is eventually going to become available to organisms to use, and can then fuel this eutrophication or algal production. And so we don't only get litter fall into the streets in the autumn, although we think about that the most, but there's also litter fall that comes in the spring. So for example, these are the male flowers of Norway maple. And so often in the spring, you'll see flowers, you'll see the bracts or the coverings of buds falling into the street. In the early part of the summer, we get a lot of material coming in. These are the immature samaras, or the seeds of maples. And the trees end up like dropping a bunch of these samaras, and then we get mature ones coming in a little bit later. You may have noticed when the squirrels are making their nests in June, they're super sloppy and they drop a lot of leaf or branch tips into the street. And so we get a lot of material coming in the late spring, early summer, and then again, of course, we get this big pulse of leaf litter coming in the fall. So we've done some rough calculations to compare how much the annual litter fall coming into streets might be contributing to stormwater runoff for phosphorus. And so each of these points represents one of these watersheds that CAP Region's been monitoring. And I've just arrayed them as a function of the fractional tree canopy over the street. So going from about 20% canopy over the street to 35% canopy over the street. And then compared that, so that's in green, that's the annual litter fall. And then in blue, I've plotted the annual runoff estimates for these same watersheds. And you can see that the tree litter fall contributes about 37 to 64% of the phosphorus that's being exported in these storm drains. So we think that this tree litter is an important contributor to nutrient pollution in our surface waters. So I've got a few other lines of evidence to support this. This is, I'm going to just tell you the results of a canopy cover study that Ben Janke led with us. So he was able to get data on stormwater nutrient concentrations and export, not only from Capital Region Watershed District, but from a number of other agencies. So I've listed them here on the right. So if any of you are represented, a big thank you. Your monitoring efforts are super helpful for us to do these kinds of analyses. So Ben gathered data from all of these agencies and then compared that to tree canopy over the street. And so that's what this figure is showing. So it's showing the stormwater nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations as a function of tree canopy cover over the street in each of these little watersheds. So the phosphorus concentrations are in blue here, and the nitrogen concentrations are in green. And you can see that there's this positive relationship, whereas you increase the tree canopy cover over the street, you see an increase in phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations in stormwater. I don't know now my, just one second, there we go. And then I wanted to highlight some work that we've done in this little residential watershed, the Arlington Hamlin Underground Watershed, or AHUG. This is in the Como neighborhood. And it's an underground facility where they're measuring export stormwater from just a small, all residential watershed. And what you can see is that if you look over the course of the year, so this is a average over, I think, 5 years of stormwater phosphorus concentrations over the season. You see a peak at leaf out, and then you see another peak at leaf drop. So this, can only be explained by the phenology of the timing of bud break and flowering, and then leaf drop of trees. So further evidence that trees are important sources of nutrients to stormwater. And then finally, I just wanted to show some work that's been done in Madison, Wisconsin by Bill Selbig, who's at the USGS in Middleton. And so he did a paired watershed study where he had two catchments, two little residential catchments, one that was a control. So basically, it didn't have intensive street sweeping. And then he had a test catchment where he did very intensive weekly sweeping and leaf removal during the spring, summer, and fall. And this watershed had these watersheds had on average 17% canopy cover over the street. And so what he found was that in the control, this is the total phosphorus yield, and he divided it up into spring in blue, summer in red, and then fall in green. I apologize if any of you are colorblind, but fall is the bottom bar. And so what you can see is that the export was much higher, particularly in the fall, in the control catchment compared to the treated catchment that had this intensive leaf removal. So I just want to pause and point out that, I don't think that trees are bad in the city. I know we get all sorts of benefits from trees, including climate regulation, cooling, shading, wildlife habitat, and plus they're just, pretty and provide aesthetic benefits. And there have even been some studies showing that they provide psychological benefits, reduced crime, reduced ADHD in children. And so we definitely want trees in our urban landscapes. We just need to be smart about managing them. So I'll come back to that. So one other way that we've identified that we're getting a lot of movement of nutrients from land to water through our streets is through overland flow or runoff. And particularly at 2 times of year, during intense rain events. And so this is a picture of an intense rain event. This is actually taken out of a window of my house. And you can see that, this is the neighbor's rain chain. You can see that we've got all this water that's moving over the landscape. It's moving over the sidewalk, over the boulevard, and into the street. And so it's probably carrying a lot of nutrients with it. And when we talk about solutions, we'll come back and I'll show you another picture of this in a transformed state. The other time that we think we're getting a lot of nutrient export from these landscapes and into our stormwater is during the snowmelt period. And so I just want to show you some data to support both of those points. So these are, again, data from that little AHUG watershed, the Arlington-Hamlin watershed. And now we're looking at the cumulative amount of phosphorus being exported from this watershed. So moving through the warm season, through the summer, into the fall. And I'm showing you different years where Cap Region had monitoring data. And then you can see that during the wet years, we get a lot more phosphorus being exported from this little watershed than during the dry years. And we think it's because we're getting a lot of runoff, and particularly in big rain events. And so you can kind of see the way that you get a big jump up in phosphorus export during single events. And we think these are, particularly heavy rainfall events where you get a lot of hydrologic connectivity between the uplands, between people's yards, and the streets and storm drains. And then we were able to extend Cap Region's measurements into the winter. And so I just want to show you data from 1 year where we measured export all winter long, which is hard to do because of the auto samplers tend to freeze and the batteries stop working. But what you can see is that there's no export when things are frozen, but then as soon as things start to thaw, then we get another big pulse of phosphorus coming off of these landscapes. And so it looks like about 50% of the phosphorus was being exported during snowmelt of this year. We don't exactly know where all that phosphorus is coming from. There are a few different possibilities. One is that there's just material that was left in the street over the winter because it fell after the street sweepers went through. Another possibility is that there's actually runoff that's happening over the surface of the frozen soil that's like washing out phosphorus from the grass thatch and from the surface of the soil. And there might also be a contribution from material that's deposited in the snowpack over the winter that then all gets released during the snow melt. And if we go back to that seasonal pattern of phosphorus concentrations in stormwater, and we look at the early part of the season, the snowmelt period, we see another peak in phosphorus concentration. So again, real evidence that we're getting a lot of phosphorus being exported at snowmelt, and then during leaf out and during leaf drop. So just to summarize what I've been talking about so far, we found in our work that household activities really dominate these urban watershed nutrient inputs. So we think about fertilizer use and pet waste. Those are really a result of decisions that people and actions that individuals are making. We also found that these urban watersheds are really good at exporting phosphorus, primarily through storm drains. They seem to, on the other hand, be retaining nitrogen, but it's possible that they aren't actually retaining nitrogen, but that we just don't have a good ability to measure the ways that nitrogen is being lost from these watersheds. And also that leaf litter fall and runoff during extreme weather events, both heavy rainfall events and also snowmelt, are significant ways that nutrients are lost to storm drains. So I want to and by talking about solutions. And I know a lot of you are involved in implementing solutions. So a lot of you probably know a lot more about some of these that I'll mention than others, but I'll highlight some work that we've been doing in this area. Hopefully that's some new information. So, the traditional way to manage stormwater nutrient pollution is through structural control measures, these end of the pipe ways of capturing stormwater and trying to clean it up before it contributes downstream to the water bodies that we care about. And there's a variety of ways that this can be done. And so really the focus is on trying to, do something right here upstream of the lake or other water body that we care about to try to reduce those nutrient inputs. And so the work that we've been doing, we're hoping to kind of get some insight into what we could maybe do farther up in the watershed as well. So for instance, reducing inputs or reducing that movement into our storm drainage network. So some alternative management strategies include things like controlling new inputs, reducing land water flows, which I'll talk the most about, and then restoring hydrologic function high up in the watershed to slow down that movement of water. These management strategies can be implemented through individual actions, or through collective actions. So if we think about controlling new inputs, the state of Minnesota has already focused on this through the restriction on phosphorus use in fertilizer. We've done some research looking at some of the factors that influence people's use of lawn fertilizer, which is now, mostly nitrogen. And it's really complicated. In work that we've done through both interviews and survey work, a lot of different factors go into people's decisions about whether to fertilize and how much to fertilize, including, sociodemographics. Older people tend to fertilize more, whether people feel like it's something that's easy for them to do, whether they have knowledge of the downstream impacts of fertilizer use. And so all of this work was done, was led by a postdoc, Nick Martini, who worked with one of my collaborators, Kristen Nelson, who's a sociologist. Similarly, there's been a little bit of work on pet waste, but not as much. But there's some work that suggests that people respond to social norms related to pet waste. So if they see signs that explain that pet waste contributes to nutrient pollution, they may be more likely to pick up their pet waste. But this seems like something that, an area that's ripe for more research. And unfortunately, I didn't include it, but I have a picture of the signs that the city of Minneapolis puts out, for instance, around the lakes related to pet waste. And so some of the research that's been done, not by us, but by others, suggests that those might be effective. In terms of reducing the flow of nutrients or the movement of nutrients from land to water, some of the work that we've been doing suggests that enhanced street sweeping can be a cost-effective way of keeping phosphorus out of downstream water bodies. So for instance, we did a study in partnership with the city of Prior Lake that some of you may be familiar with. And we found that street sweeping at the right time, so at times when there's a lot of litter fall coming into the street, and also so in the right place, so places that have a lot of tree canopy cover, we can actually bring the cost of removal of phosphorus down to, on the order of like $50 to $100 per pound, as opposed to, $1,000 or more per pound that it might cost to remove phosphorus using a more traditional stormwater or storm pond approach. And so street sweeping is, a way of preventing that nutrient pump from operating that moves nutrients from soil to the street. It can be done at the municipal level, of course. It can be done through collective action. So the Como Active Citizen Network is a great example of this. And then I know, of course, this group has been really active in promoting the Adopt a Drain program that relies on individuals to take action to keep these nutrients out of our storm drains. And again, I think this is an area that's really ripe for some sociological research. You know, how once people start doing this, do they keep doing it? Are they aware of, you know, the fact that they need to clean upstream of the drain as well as just around the drain itself? So I think there's some really interesting research questions to be asked around these kinds of individual actions. There are some challenges with street sweeping. I just wanted to acknowledge that. And some of our work suggests that, you know, one challenge has to do with the fact that different tree species have different phenologies. So they drop their leaves at different times over the course of the fall. So we did some work through the Minnesota Phenology Network where we actually tracked the phenology or the timing of different biological events, including leaf drop for different species. So this was done doing with some citizen science volunteers. And so this just shows what happened in one little neighborhood where we tracked when leaf drop started and then when it ended for each of these species. So elm, ash, some maples, oak. And then this orange block shows when St. Paul actually swept. So this was in a St. Paul neighborhood. And then where this particular neighborhood was swept. And you can see the challenge here is that, you know, we've got some species like ash or silver maple that are starting to drop their leaves quite early. And then we've got other species that don't start to drop their leaves until much later. And then, you know, like the oaks are kind of a mess because they just keep dropping their leaves all winter long. And so depending on when the street sweeping happens, you know, you might miss the majority of the leaves. So for instance, in this year, most of the ash had already been driven over and fragmented and had been washed down the storm drain by the time the street sweeping occurred. And so, you know, doing more frequent street sweeping can help you capture more of the litter fall, you know, or thinking about trying to plant trees that drop their leaves at similar times together to make it easier for cities to capture the majority of the litter fall that's going into the street. So we've been working through a grant that we got from the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council with the folks at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency to develop a street sweeping credit that for stormwater phosphorus source reduction. And so we're kind of in the final stages of putting our recommendations together so that MPCA can actually develop a street sweeping credit. And what we did for this work was we actually partnered with, in addition to data that we got from Prior Lake in a previous study, we partnered with Shoreview, Roseville, and Minneapolis. And basically, every time they swept during 2019, we got subsamples of that material and analyzed that material for phosphorus and nitrogen, and also got measures of total sweeping load to figure out like how could MPCA help cities more accurately estimate the amount of phosphorus, especially that they're picking up during their street sweeping efforts, so that MPCA could feel confident in giving them credit under their MS4 permits and for TMDLs for those efforts. And so stay tuned. I think we're getting close to settling on a method that the MPCA feels comfortable with. So hopefully they'll be rolling out that credit over the next year or so. Things have gotten a little bit slowed down, just like everything else because of the pandemic, but we are moving forward with that project. And I'm happy to answer other questions about that if you have them. And then of course, we can have individual and municipal actions to restore hydrologic function through things like rain gardens. So this is the place where that picture that I showed you previously, where we had all that overland flow. We're hoping to capture that in this rain garden. There have been rain gardens installed by, like, Capital Region Watershed District installed this one, and I know other cities and agencies are installing rain gardens or providing grants to individuals to install rain gardens. And then things like pervious pavement can also slow down that water flow high up in the watershed, so we get less transport of nutrients downstream. So I hope that by taking a watershed approach, we're able to increase our understanding of nutrient pollution in our urban surface waters and continue to come up with ideas for solving this problem so that we can increase the benefits that everybody gets from our urban waters. And with that, I'll stop by acknowledging all my collaborators, our partners, Capital Region Watershed District, our funding, and all of the projects that have contributed to the work that I shared with you today. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Sarah. Randy had a bunch of questions, so I've asked
of course,
just
Randy has
directly ask you a couple. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
Hey, Randy.
Hi, Sarah. And of course, I always have a bunch of questions.
Of course you do.
So I love, appreciate, really think it's a big piece of news. What you were saying in the middle and toward the end of the presentation about tree litter fall. What puzzles me is your earlier slides kind of characterizing the sources of phosphorus as the percentage of the total didn't include tree litter fall.
Yeah, so I have to clarify. Those early slides were looking at the sources of new inputs into the watershed. So, and then the trees are moving those nutrients around within the watershed. So this is often a source of confusion. So that's talking about two different processes. So the nutrients that trees are moving from the soil into the street came into the watershed ultimately from deposition or pet waste or fertilizer. And then the trees are moving those into the street. So we have to I was distinguishing between new inputs to the watershed versus actually like inputs to the street, which is really a movement within the watershed. I hope that helps clarify.
No, that does. That's really helpful. Though then there's a kind of corresponding percentage estimate, which is what can be reduced.
Yeah, so that's what I was. So we don't have as good of a picture of the percentage of the nutrients that are being moved into streets and storm and then exported in the storm drain that are coming from, runoff during winter, during snow melt versus during summer rainfall events versus tree litter fall inputs. And so that's something that we've tried to get money to look at, and we've not been successful yet. But I did show that one slide where we did try to make some estimates of the contribution of where we compared our litter fall and estimates of litter fall phosphorus inputs into streets with what's being exported in the storm drain. And I'll just go back to that slide. And so that's, I guess, wait, I have to share my screen just a second. Sorry, I'm gonna zoom a moment. So this slide was where we attempted to do what you're talking about, I think, where we estimated that the amount of phosphorus coming into streets in litter fall on an annual basis is equal to somewhere between 37 and 64% of the phosphorus that's being exported in runoff. Is that what you're?
Yeah, that was one of the points where I got particularly excited.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah.
That's important news.
Yeah. And so we have a student right now that is going to try to make similar estimates for more watersheds where we have the data. So what we're doing is estimating the litter fall phosphorus inputs to the street from tree canopy cover based on all of our other measurements. And then where we have monitoring data that can give us the annual stormwater phosphorus export, then we can make those comparisons for more watersheds. So stay tuned about that.
Okay.
Right, I'm going
Thanks,
to try to
Abby.
get a couple more questions in really quick because we're kind of running up to the end of our time. But Anne's wondering if you are analyzing the lake water over time to see the effects of the approaches. And if so, are you doing more than Met Council's camp program info?
Yeah, great question. So right now we don't have, so Jacques, my collaborator, is doing a lot of work in stormwater ponds at the moment, but we just submitted a big grant. If we get it, it would be amazing. It's for a new urban long-term ecological research site. We're competing with Baltimore and New York City for this project. And if it gets funded, we'll have a big lake component where we try to pull together data from not just from Met Council, but from as many agencies as we can to look at long-term trends and to try to relate those to management. So we don't have funding to do that now, but fingers crossed if we get this big grant, then that's going to be a big focus in the future.
Great. One last question. I think this is in reference to what you shared about the retention of nitrogen versus phosphorus. And so the question is the nitrogen infiltrating into groundwater? There's a big problem with excess nitrogen in wells in southern Washington County.
Yeah, so that's what, like I said, I think previously, we don't have great estimates of how much nitrogen is moving into groundwater, but anecdotally, like you're seeing in these wells, we see like right in St. Paul, even really high nitrate concentrations in springs. And so we think that probably there is a lot of nitrate that is just moving into, infiltrating down into groundwater. And interestingly, some of our upstream structural control measures should promote like denitrification and loss of that nitrogen before it moves into groundwater, but others, some of these other measures that try to promote infiltration might not necessarily remove the nitrate before it gets infiltrated. That's a big question. So yeah, it's something that we don't have great data on, but anecdotally, it does seem like there's a lot of nitrate that's being that's moving into groundwater.
Okay, well, I want to be respectful of people's time, and seeing that we're after 11:30. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation today. For everybody who was wondering if this will be recorded and shared with the group, yes, it's been recorded. I will upload it to YouTube and send out a link afterwards so that you can find that, and everything that was put in the chat, I will just copy that into a Word document so you can also grab all the links that were shared by partners during the meeting. And I hope that you all stay warm today on this beautiful fall day and go out there and rake up the leaves that are in the street so they don't export nutrients into the water, right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Wonderful.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everybody else. See you.
Bye.
Thank you.